Welcome to the CDA Institute's Expert Series, the podcast that brings you in-depth conversations with the brightest minds in defense, security, and international relations. Each week, we delve into the most pressing issues facing our world today. Steve Saideman, Philippe Lagassé, and Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux join us this week to discuss Canada's defense spending. We discuss challenges in meeting the 2% NATO threshold, how to allocate our resources to face the most pressing national security threats, optimizing spending, fiscal transparency, ITB policy, and the implications of delaying the defense policy update. This is the Expert Series. Mr. Lagassé, thanks for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you on the program. Considering that Canada ranks as the 14th largest spender on defense, are we truly lagging behind in defense spending, or do you think it's a matter of effective allocation and prioritization? Are we overly concerned with comparing ourselves to other countries despite our unique circumstances?
I think when it comes to defense spending and whether or not we're spending enough, it really depends on what question we're asking and what measure we're using. So the 2% of GDP is a measure that's useful for comparing relative effort. And that's why it makes sense to use it within an alliance context. It's not very refined. It doesn't capture qualitative contributions. It doesn't measure the quality of the capabilities that you have and things of that nature. But what it does measure is relative to what you could be spending. Are you spending on par with what the alliance considers to be your ability, right? So it's a rough measure of whether or not your effort matches that of your allies. Whether it's enough for Canada is an entirely different question. If you're looking purely at the threats that you're facing as a country and how you're responding to those threats, that may not be the best measure at all, right? You may be looking at simply what kind of capabilities do you have to meet the threat that you're facing, and you would then link your spending to your capability requirements in the threat environment that you're in. In Canada, as many commentators have noted, because we are next to the United States, we can either easy ride or free ride, or however you want to describe it when it comes to a lot of our defense concerns or threats that we face. And similarly, as a number of the critics of the 2% have noted, there's a number of new technologies that, or even long-standing technologies, such as intercontinental ballistic missiles, that render an assessment of defense spending based on actual threat very difficult in the Canadian context, because the threats that we're facing are more or less existential on a conventional level. They may be less apparent. And even more importantly, we don't tend to think of Canadian defense in terms of purely defense of Canada. We tend to think of it as forward defense, either through collective defense in NATO, collective security through the United Nations, or coalitions of the willing with the United States. So that further skews the analysis, because in a Canadian context, we're often not just talking about how much do you need to defend Canada, but how much do you need to be a good ally?
What challenges does Canada face in meeting the 2% threshold? What are the potential consequences of not meeting it when it comes to Canada's credibility within NATO and its ability to contribute meaningfully to collective defense?
The biggest challenge, I would say, for Canada is that we have an ideological issue, namely the current government, the Liberal Party, has been willing since 2015 to have fairly large deficits, and they measure our ability to pay the national debt based on the debt as a portion of gross domestic product. And therefore, they are more inclined or more willing to spend on various things at the federal level, including defense, including running deficits and seeing the debt grow, to do so, even as long as, I should say, debt as a portion of GDP doesn't become too excessive. There's a different vision, though. Recently, at least in recent memory, you'll have conservative parties that tend to say that they are in favor of spending more on the military, but they also tend to want to reduce the deficit and pay down the debt. And that's where there's, I wouldn't say a cognitive dissonance, but a much harder circle to square. Namely, how do you go about reducing the deficit and reducing the national debt, while at the same time increasing defense spending. It's not that you can't do it. It's that you either have to consider cuts to other programs, such as transfers or other things that have been put in place that are very popular with Canadians and that bring a degree of harmony with the provinces, or you increase taxes, which is, again, something that doesn't tend to be particularly popular either with Canadians or with the Conservative Party. So we're in a bit of an odd situation where, as compared to other countries who have very large debt to GDP ratios and are willing to move ahead with increased defense spending in spite of that, we've tended to be more cautious, I think, since the early 90s on account of the fact that our financial situation brought us into a very precarious situation on the international scene.
In the context of Canada's fluctuating defense spending, what are the primary historical trends and patterns that we can observe in terms of resource allocation? How does the current government strategy align or deviate from these trends?
I think the important point to note is that Canadian defense spending spikes during crises or wars. So the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the immediate aftermath of the Korean War. But there's been a fairly steady pattern of declining spending once the crisis passed or once it stabilizes. And since the 1970s, or when Pierre Trudeau was prime minister, there's been quite a bit of skepticism about how much one should spend on Canadian defense, getting back to what we were saying earlier about the technologies that are out there and the threats that we face. The reality is that Canadian defense spending rarely makes it above 2% since the 1970s of GDP. And that is even at a time when our larger allies were spending well above that. And that downward slope has been seen across, the alliance. But in the Canadian case, I think it's important to recognize that more than 2% of GDP, you may be able to reach it, but we don't have a political culture right now that would, to my mind, sustain it. And that's the real challenge. You always have to be mindful of the fact that you may spend more now, but you may be setting yourself up with a force that you may not have the funds to sustain. And you only need to look at the cuts in the 1990s to see what happens when you build up a force that you can't sustain, and how deeply those cuts can go.
What are the key national security threats and challenges that we face today? How does the current level of defense spending align with addressing those threats effectively? And how can we optimize our spending to address the most pertinent challenges?
I think Russian aggression in Europe is the clearest threat at the moment. And interestingly enough, one could argue that the way that we are addressing it through training and assistance to Ukraine has proved effective. And the deterrence posture that we have in other allied countries is sufficient to contain that threat. Now, as time goes on and the underlying weakness of the Russian military apparatus becomes more evident, does that actually, ironically enough, lend in favor of saying the best way to contain Russia is to assist border states, train them, equip them, and not spend yourself? You could spend on other things. I know that sounds callous, but when you're calculating how best to spend, that may come into the equation. When it comes to the Pacific, you have a bit of a similar calculation for Canada, where the largest threat is Chinese aggression, most notably against Taiwan, potentially. And in that context, what level of Canadian defense spending, or what can Canada field that would be materially important in that fight, in the opening salvos, since it would likely be decided fairly quickly, one would say. And here too, the question becomes, the Canadian contribution to that is likely more of a deterrence posture. And that may be more about reallocating resources from the Atlantic theater to the Pacific, or potentially acquiring some new capabilities that would bolster the deterrent in the Pacific. We haven't thought that through yet, and we haven't really seen whether or not a Canadian contribution or what that would look like. So we first need to have that discussion. The final one I would say was within North America, and here this is, I think, the real challenge, where if you are going to say what are the main threats facing Canada, you're going to point to things like cyber, you're going to point to critical infrastructure, you're going to point to resources in the Arctic, and that would all tend to lead you to greater spending on a wider variety of national security threats that may or may not be national defense per se. And yet there again, the conversation is we need to do all of this as opposed to trying to have a more sober look at how much are we actually going to spend and what's the best use of the additional dollars that you might get. And in a North American context, obviously working with the United States is key, but one concern that myself and others have had over the decades is, should you be a little bit more specialized? Is it realistic to think that Canada can successfully contribute to North American defense, the defense of Canada, the defense of Europe, and international peace and security, while still spending around 1.5% of GDP on defense? And that seems to be overly ambitious for what we're actually spending.
What is the overall effectiveness of the existing structure of defense administration in Canada, considering the role of senior officials in formulating defense policy and keeping the military accountable to civilian authority?
Well, what I would say is, at the end of the day, this is a problem that, and I'm going to be a bit of a traditionalist here, ultimately resides with ministers. The ministers and cabinet are the ones that ultimately approve the policy that then provides guidance to the military to articulate requirements and to the various civilian officials and departments to implement. If there's a misalignment between what ministers say they want to do and how much ministers are willing to spend, ultimately, that is something that politicians and ministers need to own up to, because otherwise they're putting their officials in an impossible position. Now, I'm not going to say that the armed forces and officials are totally innocent here. If you're within the officialdom, then it often makes sense to get policy cover for a project, and to do so just because that allows it to advance, and that's your ultimate goal, is to get a capability. And you therefore have a bit of an incentive to downplay the actual costs involved in that, just because you want to move it forward. And the idea being, well, we'll downplay the costs in order to get approval. And once it's, in the system, eventually the money will come, right? That can work sometimes. I think if you look at Canadian surface combatant as a good example of that. Thus far, it doesn't seem that the current government is reconsidering the number of ships it's going to build, in spite of the fact that the costs of the program are increasing and the actual maintenance cost is unclear. But another example is Future Fighter, where not only did the current government commit to spending on the Future Fighter capability, but it actually went from an initial idea of acquiring 65 aircraft under the previous government to 88 now. So there's oftentimes an understandable view within the department and within the forces that as long as they stick to the capability requirement, the money will be forthcoming. But I would implore ministers and others to take a far more sober look at how much things actually cost at the end of the day. There's a lot of talk about the fact that strong, secure, engage was fully costed, but was it really? I don't think we can say that with a great deal of confidence. It may have been fully costed to the best of our abilities at the time, but I think it's proving to be more expensive, and certainly for the long-term costs to Canada than we're willing to acknowledge. What I would encourage people to think about is their own part in why we are where we are. Canadians want everything all at once. We don't want to see failure of any kind when it comes to defense procurement, and yet we complain when the system is rigid and risk averse. We want to spend more on defense, but we also want our taxes low, and we want social spending. We demand accountability, yet we are unwilling or averse to hearing truth from our elected officials. So, and I would even say media, it's the same thing. We run after scandals and crises and never give officials that are running the system any grace. And even amongst academics and pundits, we're always willing to lob rocks and stones without ever considering how that complicates the very procurement system that we're attempting to improve. So we have our own part to play in this as observers and commentators, and I don't think we appreciate that enough.
Mr. Lagassé, thanks again for joining us. Hope to continue this conversation with you in the future. Thanks so much. Steve, thanks for joining us. It's always great to have you on the podcast. Let's jump right in. Considering that Canada ranks as the 14th largest spender on defense, are we truly lagging behind in defense spending, or do you think it's a matter of effective allocation and prioritization? Are we overly concerned with comparing ourselves to other countries despite our unique circumstances?
And I think the big thing is that whatever numbers you use, you come up with different ideas about whether Canada is doing well or not. So if you say how much Canada spends and don't use the per GDP metric, but just how much it spends overall, then we're the sixth biggest spender in NATO. And so once you make it per GDP, then that allows some countries to look better than it allows some countries to look better just simply because they've got a small economy. It's easy for Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to spend 2% of their GDP because their GDPs are tiny. So they buy a couple of artillery pieces and suddenly they're at 2%. That Greece I always beat up on is always above 2%, but we never consider them to be a particularly effective or reliable ally. I would say that Canada doesn't effectively allocate and prioritize, but 2%, if we hit 2%, that just might meant that we spend a lot of money on a piece of equipment that may not serve us well. So, for instance, the shipbuilding program is going to get us to closer to 2% because of the cost overruns. But are those the ships we need? Could we have done this better? Could we have done it faster? I think those are all reasonable questions to ask. So I think the 2% shorthand can be useful, but it tends to cause us to be distracted. We need to think about what we're buying and what is it that we need.
What are some of the reasons why NATO sets a policy goal of 2% of GDP defense spending? And do you think that the 2% expenditure target accurately demonstrates the political will of NATO member states?
I think the 2% metric is something that the allies could agree to, that everything that NATO does has to be by consensus. So what NATO agreed to do years ago under the Harper administration, and the Harper helped to put in the language, that we would move towards or aspire to 2%, which was not actually saying that we would be at 2%. We just make progress. And Canada has made progress in some ways in that, because we are now spending more money than we were under the Harper government. But there's a lot of reasons why countries spend a lot of money on their military. The United States exceeds 2%, but is that about NATO, or is that about other obligations around the world? Is it a nuclear weapons program, which is not really a NATO thing? Is it about the U.S. Congress and its demand for pork barrel spending, so that way Congress people can stay in power? Greece's spending is aimed at, largely has been in the past, personnel, which meant that it was a welfare program essentially. And then when they did arm them and gave them guns, they pointed those guns at Turkey, which is a NATO member. So I think the 2% measure, again, is something that they could agree to, and it's something that is easily measured. But I don't think that it's very helpful for understanding whether Canada is really spending enough or appropriately.
Do you think that we should try and meet the target, even if it would only be useful from an optical or symbolic perspective?
I think that it is a point of friction that can go up or down, but I think what matters more is whether Canada shows up. And Canada showed up in Kandahar, Canada showed up in Latvia, Canada actually showed up before everybody else, or nearly everybody else in Ukraine. So I think what the doing matters more than the spending. But we are at a point where our ability to do is constrained by what we're spending. That in order to follow through on our Indo-Pacific strategy, for instance, we had to move a ship from the Atlantic to the Pacific because we just don't have enough ships. And so that means that we are not as involved in the various Baltic operations as we once were at sea. And so is that really important? I think that was a reasonable decision to make. I think they kind of can explain its decisions. And I think that one of the things is we get very nervous about how NATO feels about it, but other countries have similar problems. So we're not alone in this. The document that came out last week or 2 weeks ago, where I had the Germans concerned about us, that was, either silly or outrageous, because the Germans have a much more severe problem about whether their planes can fly, their ships can sail, their tanks can drive. They've got an extreme readiness problem. And they've been an obstacle to getting stuff delivered to Ukraine. Remember, they were the ones blocking the sale and delivery of tanks. So I think it matters, this 2% thing, but I don't think it should be driving decisions, and it shouldn't be driving our conversations as much as it does. It's simple, so it dominates, but it's not necessarily useful.
How could we better allocate funding we already have so that we're more effective with it, as opposed to perhaps increasing the percentage of GDP?
Well, this is really tricky because the politicians have their priorities, and their priorities are winning elections. And the best way to do that is not to appear strong on defense, but to create jobs in areas where there are votes. And so the shipbuilding program is a jobs program more than defense program. I'm very fond of showing the Liberal Defense Platform cover from 2015 because it mentions jobs, but it doesn't mention defending Canada on the front cover because they define the shipbuilding program as jobs. So I think it's going to be very hard for us to ever make a lot of progress in this, given the incentives that all the politicians face. But I would say that if we develop longer-term planning, so for instance, a strong, secure, engaged document was good in that it developed long-term planning, and it made a bunch of commitments that they're following through on. What's happened lately is the Liberals have made a lot of promises about long-term programs, but it's less clear that they're willing to allocate new money. So the announcements around NORAD modernization, we're going to spend $40 billion. And it's like, okay, well, what is that money going to be spent on? And how are you committing the spending? And is it going to squeeze things out of the defense budget? Or are you going to increase the defense budget? And that's why a lot of people were disappointed a couple of weeks ago when the budget came out, because it didn't show any real commitment to spending new money, despite the fact that they made a bunch of commitments that indicated there'd be new money spent. So there's that contradiction. And I think that's really one of the things that helped to spawn the famous letter of last week or 2 weeks ago that your organization sponsored to get, the establishment to say that things are gone awry.
How much has this current government spent on defense relative to previous administrations, and what are some of the historical trends in terms of defense spending?
Well, one of the continuities in Canadian defense politics is that each government, when they want to cut spending in the budget, if they face budget deficits, they tend to focus on the military because that's the biggest part of discretionary spending. And this is true in other countries as well. And so that's the temptation. And so that's what Harper did. That's what Chrétien did. So that's something that multiple parties do. I would say one of the differences between Trudeau and Harper is that Harper was really focused on budget deficits. That was his big campaign promise in 2015 when he was getting down to a balanced budget. And so he really spent far less in the military in 2014, 2015 than one would have expected given his rhetoric in 2008 in the Canada First Defense Program. Whereas the Trudeau government has come in and they did do their defense review and they did make a bunch of decisions, and now they are buying the F-35. They are continuing to spend large amounts of money on the shipbuilding program. They've added a third shipyard to that program. So they are spending more money. I can't speak to the exact statistics, but I want to say that the defense budget has risen significantly. Absolutely. Not relative to 2%, but absolutely we're spending more money now than we were 10 years ago. I think the defense budgets back then were in the order of $18 to $20 billion, and now they're up to $26 to $30 billion. That's real money. That's a real difference. And even if you control for inflation, and defense inflation tends to be higher than our own inflation, the Liberals have spent more money, but they've spent less money than what their promises would suggest they should spend. So that's where the trap they're caught in, which is they need to spend yet more money to do the things. They keep on talking about NORAD modernization as the unwritten chapter of the strong, secure, and engaged defense review. Well, it was not in it because they didn't want to spend the money on it. I mean, I think that they didn't know exactly what they wanted to promise. Maybe they didn't want to face some other decisions, but they left it out for a variety of reasons. It was definitely on the horizon in 2016, 2017, but it's not an unwritten chapter. It was something they had not written and they had not funded, and now they've been talking about it ever since. It's something. Well, this is something that we always implied. It's like, no, it wasn't, and that was a deliberate decision. And now they're facing the consequence of that, which now they've got to make decisions on what to spend. And so this defense policy update that's coming out soon-ish, the big question will be, what promises do they make about what they're going to spend money on? And I can guarantee you, well, I can almost guarantee you, that the next unwritten chapter will be the submarines. I don't think they're going to want to tackle the submarines in this document, this review, because that would imply another 20, 30, 40 billion dollar project. And either they spend a lot more money, which would help get them to 2%, but that would mean sacrificing other interests, raising taxes, something. So I don't think they're going to tackle the submarines, despite the fact that the Navy leaked a document saying, hey, we want 10 submarines, which was somebody was smoking something when they were coming out with that idea. So I do think that this government is spending more, but it's still writing, its mouth is writing checks that they're not willing to cash. So I think that's an enduring problem.
Steve, thanks once again for joining us. Always a pleasure. Mr. Giroux, it's great to meet you. It's fantastic to have you on the program. Thanks for taking some time out of your schedule to meet with us today. How would you assess the potential implications of delaying the update to Canada's defense policy in terms of clarity around military funding commitments?
So we look at the planned spending, and we did that in 2022 when the government was already a couple of years into its strong, secured, and engaged defense policy, under which there's like hundreds of billions of dollars that are planned to be spent on defense issues, both from an operational perspective, but also on capital expenditures. So we looked at that plan in it with its first couple of years being behind the government, and we found that the government was slower than expected, at least in the capital expenditures aspect of its strong, secure, and engaged defense policy program. So that delay in spending resulted in about $10 billion in spending that did not materialize in the first 5 years, I think, of the SSE policy document. So all that means is that the government will have to speed up the pace of spending on its capital expenditures. But if you were planning on spending X billions of dollars in 2019, for example, you couldn't meet that spending commitment, you postpone that same amount out into the future, the amount of equipment or capabilities that you can acquire years into the future with that same amount has diminished because of inflation, which is something we've all experienced in the last few years. So all that to say, the delay in spending means that the real value of these same fixed amounts of money has diminished. So it probably means that when the government updates its strategy, it will probably need to rejig some of its planned expenditures, either reallocate across business lines or capabilities, or increase the overall amounts it wants to spend, or advance some of the money that was planned on being spent in the outer years and advance that into closer to now, so that the real value of the overall envelope is maintained as a result of the delays we have seen in the last couple of years.
Are there any specific areas within Canadian defense spending that the Parliamentary Budget Office believes requires increased scrutiny or reallocation of resources?
I think generally speaking, procurement projects seem to be difficult to get a firm grasp on, because I'll give you an example, and that's a telling example. The Canadian surface combatants, so warships, every time somebody looks at the cost of the overall project, there's only one way the costs go, and it's up. So the government announced the program years and years ago, and it was a few tens of billions of dollars. A couple of years ago, looked at that again, and the cost had risen to 50-something billion dollars. Last time we looked at the cost of the CSC, as we call them, the cost of acquisition, like development, design, acquisition, has gone up to $80 billion for 15 warships. So I think that's one area where the government, and I don't mean just D&D, but the government as a whole, including public services, need to get a better grasp as acquiring major equipment, because it's either we don't have a good, accurate cost estimate to begin with, or there are delays that are detrimental. Well, we know delays are detrimental to the cost. Like, costs go up the longer you take to acquire these major pieces of equipment. But I don't have a good explanation as to why these costs keep on increasing and the delays keep happening. So I think that collectively it's something that as a country we would usually benefit from having a better handle on major procurement projects. The F-35 is another good example, but in that case, it was decisions that were made and then undone and then had to be made again to procure the fighter jets. So it's probably a special case, but for the surface combatants, that's one example, and there are other examples where, as a country, I don't think we have as good a control over the decision making and the procurement process for these pieces of equipment, which results in us collectively spending more than what we should, I think.
How could improved fiscal transparency impact defense spending decisions?
So the more you shed light on how much something is costing and how costs evolve over time, I think it provides an incentive for the acquisition and procurement and the construction phases to improve and to give better value for money for taxpayers, but also for the D&D personnel, the Canadian Armed Forces personnel that will be using these equipment. So if we can get the same types of ships, for example, to use that example again, for 50 billion as opposed to $80 billion, if we get the same type of equipment for significantly cheaper, it's a win-win, I think, for the taxpayers, but also for the military personnel that will be using this equipment, because it means that for the same amount of money, the personnel can have more equipment, or can have equipment that's better suited to their needs. So I think shedding light on the deficiencies in the decision-making, acquisition, procurement processes can only lead to improvements. I don't think it can make it worse. It can only make it the same or better. So I think from that perspective, transparency when it comes to decision to acquire certain types of equipment and the way in which delays affect their cost and potential alternatives, I think that can only be beneficial for D&D, the Canadian Armed Forces, but also taxpayers. The other part of your question, I think, is probably a consequence of the first answer I gave. So the more information and clear information that parliamentarians have, information that they can understand, the more of that type of information they have, the better equipped they will be to question the government and to understand first what's going on, and to question the government and eventually propose alternatives. For example, the government is adamant that warships have to be built in Canada to the extent possible. But for example, if parliamentarians were to find out that it would be like, I don't know, half cheaper, like half the cost to have these built abroad and Canadianized in the country, maybe they would be a bit less inclined to insist these warships be built in Canada, even though there are security reasons to have a made in Canada capacity to build these warships. So these are the kind of trade-offs that parliamentarians can better make if they have the information. But in the absence of information, if the government tells them, we have to buy that type of ship and it has to be built in Canada because the alternative is unthinkable for security reasons and it wouldn't be that much cheaper, then parliamentarians are not like individual parliamentarians who have a lot of responsibilities other than just focusing on D&D, might not be in a good position to challenge the government on these assumptions. But if they have that information, then they can ask questions and they may very well end up making the exact same decisions. Maybe not, but maybe they will make the same decisions, but at least these will be better informed decisions.
We are expecting a defense policy update soon. We recently announced a new budget. What challenges might arise for the domestic defense industry in meeting any accelerated procurement demands resulting from a substantial increase in planned capital expenditures? Could you touch on any strategies that could be employed to ensure sustainable operations?
We're seeing that with the demands for weapons and ammunitions with the war in Ukraine. So Canada and many countries at the same time ramping up their needs and their capabilities in the area of defense puts a big strain, potentially put a big strain on the industry and individual businesses and corporations that are supplying these equipment and ammunitions. So the challenge there for a revised defense policy and ramping up spending is the strain this will put on the domestic industry, defense industry, at a time where many sectors are faced with labor shortages. And obviously, the defense sector relies on specialized skills. So not everybody can work in defense industries, and it certainly needs engineers and specialists that are trained on that type of equipment. So that poses significant challenges for the domestic industry. So how to alleviate these challenges? I think the recipe is probably broadly similar to the recipe that many sectors are facing. Immigration, although in defense it's a bit more delicate because of the sensibility or sensitivity rather of the sector. So immigration, training of skilled labor, but also more recourse to automation when it's possible, more standardization with our allies so that equipment built abroad is interchangeable with equipment or ammunitions or spare parts that is available domestically and vice versa, so that we can more easily exchange spare parts, ammunitions, and weapons more generally with our allies. And again, as I said before, I'm not a specialist, so these are remedies that are common to many industries. And I think that we already have a quite high level of interoperability with our allies, but I'm sure there's still room for improvement. And I should also add longer term planning. So if in the defense sector has certainty with respect to the long-term track of spending, they can invest for the long term as opposed to meeting a demand that is short term, a spike in demand to respond to a war in Europe, in Ukraine, for example. But if there's a commitment to invest and spend in the longer term by governments in Canada and abroad, I think it makes more business sense for the defense industry to invest and meet the longer term needs rather than just meet a demand that is one-off, 1 year or two.
How effective do you think ITB policy has been?
We looked at the ITB policy a year ago, and we found that most of the needs for corresponding investment is being done through direct and indirect, but direct and indirect spending in the areas of the sector that is benefiting from the government contracts, but very few of these benefit from the multiplier effect. So under the industrial technology benefit program, an entity that receives government funding for military contract can be exempted from spending one for one if it invests, for example, in R&D, research and development, or a post-secondary institution. but very, very few of these of the spending to meet the ITB requirements get spent in R&D or post-secondary institutions. In fact, it accounts for only 5%, which is surprising because you'd think that an industry benefits from lighter requirements to spend. The multiplier can be anywhere between 4 and 9. So it means that an industry or a company that invests $1 in R&D, for example, can get credited for between $4 and $9 of investment. So it reduces the investment they need to make to comply with the requirement, but only 5% gets spent that way. 95% gets spent in areas where they get 1-for-1 credit, and some of it, around half, is indirect. So it can be anywhere from catering for their employees to services that are not really creating any major economic benefits for Canada. So I can't really make recommendations, but like you see that type of spending doesn't create what Canadians would expect to be material economic benefits. So I think there are obvious ways to improve and tighten a bit the industrial benefit, that component of the requirements, the policy, to get better, I think, better outcomes, better capacity, like R&D and post-secondary institutions. Investment in these sectors would clearly be of bigger benefits to Canada than catering services or cleaning services, or like services that might not necessarily generate significant new innovations or benefits.
Thanks once again, Mr. Giroux. It's been an absolute pleasure. That's all for this week's episode of the CDA Institute Expert Series. To learn more about the CDA Institute, you can visit our website at cdainstitute.ca, or you can subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks, and we hope you'll be joining us next week.